Okay, we're live, and this is Gaspar, and I'm here talking to Kyle about his principle of simple unity. Um,
Yep.
so you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a principle that I've been kind of developing a little bit to kind of help clarify, I guess, because I guess another principle is kind of related to this. It's called the PSR. And according to the PSR, there's an explanation for every effect. So anything that's like contingent, right, within nature has an explanation. And typically the PSR is used as an argument against like things like brute facts or that sort of thing. Um, And so there's a book I should briefly mention, which is called Necessary Existence by Alexander Proust and Josh Rasmussen. And they kind of go over, they use the PSR to basically show that there's like this necessary existence to reality. Like there's something in reality that necessarily exists, right? Otherwise, you're gonna even if you have like an infinite regress, right? Let's say if there's like an infinite regress of causes and effects, you're still gonna have to have some sort of like necessary foundation to kind of ground that in, right? So that's the PSR. No, there's different versions of the PSR. There's like weaker versions, but another related principle that I've been working on is called the principle of simple unification. And what it basically is it's kind of combining the PSR with Occam's razor. Maybe not like directly, but it's kind of like simplifying the sort of explanations that we need. So instead of having a bunch of like necessary facts or brute facts like at the layer at the foundation of reality, we only have one root that kind of grounds all of them in, right? Um, so I guess in short, you could say that the principle of so the principle of simple unification simply says that for any set of things, whether contingent or necessary, that exist, it is possible that there is a simple root that unifies, or you can call it a simple root, or you can call it like a simple unification root, right? And I want to clarify that in case someone, I've had some, actually Nick pointed this out, where if you apply the principle to itself, well, the simple root still is going to need a simple root within it. So I clarified and just, I guess a better way to say it would be a simple unifying root, right?
Yeah.
So if you do have one set of something and that one set is the root itself, well, there's nothing else to be explained because that is the unifying root, right? So that kind of entails everything else, right? And I think this,
Before we get
yeah,
past this particular objection that was brought up, I want to point something out. So you mentioned that the objection was brought up that well, what happens when we apply the principle to itself? Now, this this is a structural problem, but it applies to many ideas. So, I mean, you could do that with Hitch and Drazer. Claims asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Does that need a claim?
right,
You can do it with
right,
you can do it with the principle of sufficient reason. You can do it with all these different ones, and so this is where, and I'm not trying to be biased, but like what really
yeah.
matters to me is the pragmatic use of an idea.
No, yeah,
So the
that is important.
functionality is more important to me.
So this is
And
yeah. So
one last thing.
okay, go
The
ahead.
functionality is what is important to me. Unless you're claiming somehow that an idea is grounded in metaphysics, then I would say that idea inherits all of these flaws that come with concepts. All right. All right. So now you can go
Yeah.
on. Yeah. Carry on.
So it's basically it works the same way. So it doesn't have to be applied to metaphysics. So you could actually apply it to a scientific hypothesis, right? So if we have two hypotheses that explains a set of data, we can have one hypothesis that has, let's say, four equations to it, right? And these four equations kind of explain certain phenomena. But then we have another hypothesis which only has one equation, and that one equation can explain everything that the four equations do. Okay. Now, scientifically speaking, we prefer the theory with one equation because that's the simpler theory. Like if we don't need the other four equations, and if we just need that one equation, then we only use that one equation, right? So it really simplifies kind of, I guess, a root explanation. And then another thing I want to point out is physicists to this day are still trying to like figure out how to combine all the laws of physics into one law, right? So if you go to let's take quantum mechanics, right? So you have the Schrodinger equation, you have the uncertainty principle. You go to general relativity, you have Einstein's equations, right? So what physicists are trying to do is they're trying to combine these two theories, right? And the idea behind that is to come up with some equation or set of equation or whatever that kind of explains how these two theories work together. And basically the whole goal of science is to get down to one equation, one simple equation that kind of explains everything, right? And that's those are the best scientific hypotheses because it's a simple theory, right? It only has one equation, but it has great explanatory power because it can kind of explain scientific phenomena. So we can see that principle being used within science itself, right? Especially when we're trying to compare theories and see which one is more simple than others. And so I think what we should really be doing is we should apply the principle to science, but we should also apply it to our metaphysics. And that's kind of my whole idea.
Okay, so yeah, so I was about to ask you to clarify the scope. Is this principle just for science, or is it for philosophy?
I think so it could be used. I think it could be used for philosophy as well. So there's other for example, simplicity and explanatory power themselves. They can be used for science, but they can also be used for metaphysical theories, right? And so this is something that Graham Oppy does in his book, The Best Argument Against God. Now, we're not going to talk about God much in this discussion, but he does use what's called theoretic virtues, which is basically these things like simplicity, explanatory power, predictability, stuff like that, to kind of build his metaphysical theory of naturalism, right? So you do see this sort of thing happen even within like metaphysics, right? So while you could use it in scientific hypotheses, you can also use it in metaphysical hypotheses as well.
Okay.
So.
All right. So now the principle itself is not the unifying principle. You would say that it's a principle that says that we need unifying principles.
Yeah. Right.
Given,
just like
yeah.
Yeah. Just like the PSR isn't the necessary like foundation for reality. It's just kind of like the tool to kind of get us to a necessary foundation. The same way, the principle of simple unification, that principle is not itself the root, right? It kind of guides us to the root. Now, what that root is, I don't know. That can be debated upon, but that's not the point. The point is that there is a simple root. Okay, we can, debate about what that is, right? But again, I think both sides, if we're gonna debate about what the simple root is, well, we're not really debating about the principle itself. What we're debating about is what the simple root is, right? So I do think that both sides, pretty much everybody could accept that principle, right? At least that's what I think. I don't know. I know there's like certain objections that people may have, but
okay.
Yeah.
So if we accepted that, all right. So instead of having a bunch of brute facts free floating, creating conflicting systems that are generated by them, then it would seem that the best candidate to rescue us from that scenario would be the idea of unification. So like if we just look within certain systems, or within certain areas, like for example, as you know, like I'm an advocate of paraconsistent logic, and so, but I'm also an advocate of classical logic. Both of them, despite them being at conflict, fundamentally. And I would say that I don't know, maybe there's something that could unify those two. Maybe in the most abstract sense, they both arrive at conclusions or something.
Right.
But
yeah.
I would say the strength. I would say we actually benefit from having models that are totally contrary to each other. That allows us to evaluate the territory of phenomenon in different ways, and when one model doesn't work, we get to use a different one that functions in a totally different way. So so I guess what it comes down to is like if we took something as fundamental in logic as the law of non-contradiction, and there are people who really don't want you to ever question that. But I mean, at the end of the day, and people have done just about everything thinkable in any of these fields. But at the end of the day, you can't really defend the law of non-contradiction without using the system that it generated. And so it can just kind of be omitted in order to make other systems. But the other thing
Right.
is, and so I'm wondering, like, when we generate these unifying principles from the principles of simple unification, do they suffer the same fate as a principle like the law of non-contradiction, where we can just brush them off to the side and invent their antithesis?
Well, it depends, right? Because you could have what's called competing models of a simple root, right? So you could have different theories of what that simple root may be. And obviously, there's not a simple root that unifies those theories about what the simple root is, right? So I do think that there can be competing theories about what the simple root actually is. Whether it's God or whether it's like some natural abstract object, right? So in that sense, it doesn't. Yes, there's going to be some sort of like disagreements, right? Some sort of like incompatibilities going on, obviously,
Yeah.
right?
So
Um,
I'd say that if
in that case, then I would just say, well, then let's look at which theories of simple roots are better than others, right? And that's the next step, I think.
yeah,
So
so that standard of whatever we're gonna call it, whatever we're going to use to decide which theories are better, is going to be really essential. Although I have questions about how rigorous it can be, because if we accept the fact that there are multiple candidates for unifying principles, then in my opinion, we're back at square one with a bunch of free-floating brute facts. And so so to escape the brute facts, we came up with unifying principles, but there are many unifying principles, so we're just back in a world of free.
well, no, there's not many unifying. So it's not like they don't all exist, right? There's just different
I would say,
theories
yeah, I
about
would
what
say,
might
yeah,
what might exist.
yeah. So I'm
Yeah.
not a Platonist, so I would say none of them exist, right? None of these ideas exist, is how I would say it. But that's a different conversation. I would say these are ideas that we define to solve our problems or to predict phenomena, and that's why it's okay to just come up with them and see if they work. Um, and so I'm and so although all these ideas may have inherent flaws, like, principle of sufficient reason, does it need a sufficient reason? That
And
doesn't matter. That doesn't
and it
matter.
may, I mean, it may turn out that there really is only one candidate that could be the simple root, right? So that's another question, whether if there are multiple candidates, what if there's only one candidate that can be the simple root? And I think that's interesting to think about. So
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that is interesting. So this does, in my opinion, this does feed back into like kind of a cycle of the different branches of philosophy. So like, and like with metaphysics, we want to know the nature of reality, but with epistemology, that feeds right into like, well, how do we know when we see uh, ultimate reality? So okay, well, now we need epistemology, and
right,
we will know what we know when we can establish something as true. And of course, in logic, we will know that something is true when it corresponds to reality. So it's this big catch 22, of like, oh well, we need, in order to have metaphysics, we need epistemology, and in order to really have epistemology, we at least need some form of logic, and in order to have soundness, we at least need to be able to say that it corresponds to reality, which means that we need some degree of metaphysics established. So it's
it's a
this kind of,
cycle.
yeah. So it's like a catch-22. To me, this is not futile. This is not nihilistic. Unless you are a like verificationist or some kind of absolutist, it just means that we need to stop chasing after absolutes and ask ourselves, what is the real functionality of this idea, and how does it serve us, and is it really doing its job? And so, rather than point out or poke holes in an idea like, the principle of sufficient unification by saying, oh, this or that problem, take your pick, because there are so many problems that ideas can have. I would rather ask, what's the utility that it lends to the ideas that would be generated from it, or the ideas that it unifies, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you did mention Platonism earlier, which I actually think that if Platonism is true, right, I think there would be only one kind of like absolute Platonic form that grounds all the others, right? So, and again, we can debate about what that actually is, but yeah, I mean, unless you're like a modal realist where you think like every thing actually, like every necessary thing, like there's an infinite amount of necessary truths or something, um, I don't think it's not going to really avoid the principle. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I would say that I'm not actually a true Platonist. I think that basically, however, based on how you define your metaphysics, I mean, you could make a coherent Platonist worldview. You could also make a coherent nominalist or mathematically non-realist point of view that would be valid. But we're back to the cycle of metaphysics. Is like, how are we going to know whether it's completely sound? And so then and so to me, if I'm willing to entertain that many ideas, then I really, at the end of the day, embrace a pragmatist point of view. So in a world where we can basically define our categories and where all of our ideas have a number of inherent flaws, I'm more interested in how we use the ideas. So,
Okay. So I have a
yeah,
question. So would you say that this is like a pragmatic idea where we want to simplify our theories down to one simple thing that explains all like necessary truths or something like that? Because I mean that's how we do science, right? So the prior probability of a simple root that kind of grounds reality is higher than if you have just a bunch of these necessary truths or facts just kind of like floating out there without a unifying structure. What do you think about that?
I guess I would have to. Sorry. Can you maybe just reword that, like, briefly?
Yeah, so the prior probability of there being one simple root rather than just a bunch of necessary facts is higher, right? So if you're so basically you have two theories. So one theory says there's a simple root. Another theory says that there is no simple root. There's just a bunch of brute facts.
Okay.
Well, would you agree that the prior probability of the simple root hypothesis is better, right? Because it has better unification than the theory that doesn't have unification.
Okay. So rather than try to establish a case of probability for the simple root theory, I think it's just a better route for you to just, like, coin it as a heuristic or some kind of first principle, because if you're saying it's foundational, then you shouldn't be deriving it from other material. I would think, and so and then when you say probability, are we going off of soft philosophical induction, or are we actually going, like, what kind of probability are we talking about?
Just induction,
Yeah,
right?
I think, remember, by definition, inductive conclusions don't follow. They're leaps, and that's also their strength. That's their strength and their weakness.
Well,
And
yeah, I'm only talking about the prior probability. I'm not talking about like
yeah,
the evidence that we would actually have for that sort of thing. So
yeah, and
yeah,
all I'm doing is highlighting that, like, people could generate many conclusions, and so I'm not sure if I would say it's actually significantly more probable than the alternative, but I would say that it's perfectly permissible to 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 coin it as a principle, um, and just look at things like the principle of sufficient reason or Hitchens razor. Despite their kind of laughable self-refuting nature, no one cares because they're so useful, right? Um,
right.
and so that's ultimately what makes it hold its ground. And so I think that's what it would really come to. Like, can this be as useful as one of those ideas, such that, even though it's a snake that bites its own tail, or even if it may be, yeah, it's really about its application. Like, for example, you also know, you've probably seen, I actually employ Munchausen's trilemma sometimes. That has the same problems we can say about Munchausen's trilemma. Is it a brute fact? Is it circular, or is it regressive? But that's not the point. You don't put it on the table as a proposition. You use it and you question something to one of those three exits. So I think the question is, can you take it from its propositional form, and instead of actually asserting it, can you use it? You know,
Yeah.
and so
And I do think that my principle of the PSU, I guess you could say, that's like the short term, is actually useful for scientific theories, right? So if it's useful for scientific theories, right, then I'm pretty sure we can use it as metaphysical theories as well. I mean, that's what I think, but I mean, I know other people may have different views, but
yeah,
yeah.
that might be a little bit triggering for me. I mean, I'm very Kantian about metaphysics. I think it's I'm not saying I don't believe in reality, but I really am skeptical about concepts and their ability to talk about reality. So as soon as we start trying to talk about metaphysics, we basically aren't talking about reality because we're using concepts. So in that way, yeah. So the idea that logic or like the pure rational or the purely empirical could get us to metaphysics, I think I object to that, and yeah. So yeah, but that's a
No,
different
that's fine,
discussion. That's a
because
different
yeah,
discussion. Yeah.
because my sorry, go on.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, you can keep going.
No, because my own perspective is I think that reason can help us kind of look into the foundation for things, right? Um, I don't think we don't. Of course, we're not going to rely on like empirical methods, right? Because once we start talking about the foundation for reality, then we're going to have to use some sort of like either a priori reasoning, or it's either like some a priori reason, or we apply some principle to it, right? To kind of test the theory and see, okay, what is this what is this thing we're talking about, right? Like one view I take is that geometric objects cannot be independent, meaning that the foundation for reality is not geometric. Okay. Now, if that's true, then that has implications, because that means any sort of like scientific theory that tries to start off with a geometric object, well, I'm not going to accept that, because I think all geometric objects are dependent in nature, right?
Now, what do you mean by
So
dependent?
that means they depend on something else for their existence, right? Because I think that geometric objects are inherent; they have inherent limitations, and because they have those sort of like brute limitations, then they're not going to be able to be sufficient for something that's, that doesn't depend on anything else.
Yeah. Well.
So
Okay. So
yeah,
I mean, they are subject to the same issues, which I believe you just articulated. But they're all right. So I have right now Euclid's Elements, and he starts off just basically having to kind of spell this stuff out and make it up. So he starts off with definitions and says, a point is that which has no part. 2, a line is breathless length. 3, the extremities of a line are points. And he just says this stuff, and he has to basically invent these so that we can start talking about geometry. And I've never gone through this process, but apparently people just invent totally different
yeah,
geometries. Apparently people just with different fundamentals just make the weirdest geometries thinkable. Not, like I said,
right.
I've never actually gone through that process, but you can do it. And so this to me would, yeah. So
Those are inherent. Those are what's called inherent limitations, right? So yeah.
yeah. So the idea of all right. So again, you said they're dependent. Geometric objects are dependent, so they're not. Again, what did you say they're dependent on? Again.
Something that's not geometric.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I don't even know what that would look like, because but yeah. So
Well, I mean, I guess this gets back to the Platonist discussion, because there are those who believe that mathematical objects and geometrical entities and the like have their own intrinsic existence. Um, Now, in my opinion, this is sort of resolved by a semiotics perspective. The idea that our symbols or our concepts really get their meaning by what they're compared to. So, if we just invented like the Roman numerals, but we only had the letter 3, that wouldn't mean very much. We need all those numbers, so that they basically give contrast to each other. They define each other in a way as this set, and then we can argue about what the most useful symbols are, and then maybe we decide that the Arabic numerals are more efficient because they use zero in place value. And so even though maybe both models are true, one is more efficient, so we scrap the Roman numerals and use the Arabic numerals. That whole thing. And yeah, maybe the characters 0 through 9 don't they don't exist independently. But that's not a problem in my opinion. What's important is that we know how to use them, and that we predictably are able to solve problems using these sort of fictitious ideas that we put together. So then, like, one of my objections to maybe an overcommitment to something like unification or like monads or like Plato's ultimate form, the good, is maybe it aggrandizes these concepts. Maybe because if you take the non-realist approach to mathematics or concepts, then these concepts are really just like tools, like hammers and drills. And do you need hammers and drills unified? No, you use them to do something, and then you throw them in the garage when you're done. And that's what I think we need to do with our ideas. So yeah.
Right.
So that's just sort of my idea about that, and I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm saying, as I pointed out, the ultimate, really the ultimate test, I believe, for such a principle of unification will be its applicability, which you mentioned you think that is possible through various avenues. So yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
But yeah, it's something I'm working on because I think it'll be helpful, right? To especially in debates about God's existence. So it's going to really help both theists and atheists. Kind of, it might actually help to come to a better understanding, right? Because you typically what you see is you have theists that hate brute facts. They don't like brute facts because once you have a brute fact, then you don't need God, right? Because you don't need a deeper explanation, right? Whereas the naturalists, what they don't like is, well, actually, I should say this: they don't like complexity. So what the naturalists want is like a bunch of brute facts with no God. So like they'll say like theism, like the reason why God created the universe, those are brute facts, and then we don't need God, so therefore they just are kind of there, right? And this is something that Graham Oppy points out, right? And I think what this principle is going to do is kind of help clarify, kind of like unify both sides, right? So I'm hoping that it'll advance the conversation better.
Yeah. Well, perhaps it will.
But we'll see. I mean, it doesn't have to be philosophy of religion. It could be, scientific theories or, whatever. But yeah.
Yeah, I see. All right. Well, I guess for the most part we covered this topic.
Yeah.
So yeah. If maybe since we touched on Platonism, maybe we should have another conversation about that material sometime or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not a Platonist, so but I guess we could talk about it.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe I
If you want.
I thought maybe you. I thought that was maybe baked into a degree to the idealism situation.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I know Rats is a Platonist, so you can talk to him about that. But
All right. So
I'm not.
all
Yeah.
right. Okay. I see. Interesting. Huh. Yeah. So he's a Platonist, and like, okay. So like to him, and I know he uses the Hermetic laws as well. Like those are almost kind of like those Platonic forms that generate things.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Which, I mean, even under my view, you could take them like that, but I don't. I see laws as just descriptions, right? So I don't think they have to be Platonic, right?
Yeah.
So.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. Yeah. Well. Cool. Well, maybe we can talk about that sometime. But I think we covered the main topic for this video. So yeah, it was nice talking to you, and that's
All
it.
right.